Hello friends, welcome back to the video lecture series. In this video, we'll be discussing how to make the journal entries. We'll also solve a few journal entries. We'll also make a few journal entries by taking some examples. Right. So let's start. In the last video, what we have covered is we have seen what a journalizing means, right? What is journalizing? Journalizing is nothing but there is a book called journal wherein we do write the transactions that happen in a business in the language of debit and credit. What we have seen is we have seen that every transaction has at least two accounts. One of those accounts is recorded on the debit side, the other one is recorded on the credit side, and the way in which how we record these transactions in the journal book are called as journalizing. We have also seen the format of journal. There is a specific format in which we pass the journal entries. How the format looks like is this manner. We have two sides. The left hand side, we have two sides wherein we record the amount of debit on one side and the credit on the other. Journal entries are recorded in a chronological manner, which means as and when the transactions happen, we do record that in the same manner, right? Say for example, if there is any transaction which happens on 1st of January, then we will say 1st of January. Then we'll write the debit entry first, the debit transaction first, or the debit account first, and then this would be followed by the credit transaction. All we need to understand is the first line would be dedicated towards the debit account to be debited, and the second line would be dedicated to the account which is to be credited. And the amount of debit is recorded under the debit column, amount of credit is recorded in the credit column, right? So let's solve a few questions wherein the journal rules of journal entries are to be followed. Right, before we start, let's see how to read the journal entries, because unless and until we understand this, the next step would be very difficult for us to understand, which is the posting into the ledger. So posting into a ledger account would be easier for us if we know how to read the journal entries, right? So let's see how to read that. Say for example, if we say on 4th of April, Aman started electrical appliances business with a cash of rupees 20,000. Now, if we look at the journal entries in the books of Aman, it would look like something like this, wherein what we do is the date we would be recording it here. We would say 4th of April under the dates column. Then we need to see what are the two accounts which are being affected in this transaction. As we know, one would be the cash account and the other one would be the capital account. Now comes the question, which account is to be debited and which is to be credited. Cash being in the nature of asset, capital is already in the nature of capital. In the previous slides, we have seen under the modern approach, we have seen that whenever any asset increases, it is to be debited, and whenever a liability increases, it is to be credited. I hope you understand the rules of debit and credit by this time. If you do not, then you need to go back and look into the video wherein we have seen the rules for debit and credit. Under both the methods, namely the traditional method and the modern approach. Right, so if you look at that video lecture, you will find that cash account is to be debited here and the capital account is to be credited here. So what I need to do is, whichever account is to be debited, I would be recording that on the first line, and that would be starting from this line, right? So my first account would be the cash account. I would say cash account debited, and I would say to capital account. The amount would be 20,000, so the debit amount would be recorded here 20,000, the credit amount would be recorded 20,000, like this. And then we are supposed to write the narration, which would say, being business started with cash rupees 20,000. Then what we are supposed to do is we need to total this here. I would be writing the total on the debit side 20,000, total of 20,000 on the credit side. Assuming that there is only one transaction in this page, what I would do is I would write the totals of the debit column here and total of the credit column here, and this amount is to be carried forward to the next page in case if there are more than one transaction, right? So now the question is how to read the journal entry. How to read this? We would read it like this. We would say by cash account debit to capital account credit. We do not write these terms, but the way how we need to read is we would say by cash account debit to capital account credit. If we understand these two terms, the posting to the ledger accounts would be very easy to us. When, say for example, in this case, if it is mentioned by cash account, which means in capital account I would be writing by cash, and in the cash account I would be writing to capital. The format is you need to write only cash account debit to capital account, but the way how we need to read it is a bit different. We would read it like this. We would say by cash account debit to capital account credit. These two are not written, but these are to be read out, so that the concept of to and by becomes easier for us, and the next step, which is related to posting into the ledgers, would become very easy to us, right? Now let us look at the next transaction. It says on 6th of April, Aman purchased 20 fans at the rate of 1000 each. There is no mention of the name from whom we have purchased, so we would assume in the accounting parlance that this is a cash transaction. But if you look at the other transaction, it says we have purchased 50 tube lights from Messrs. Balaji Limited. And there is no mention whether we have paid in cash or we have paid through check. So we would be, the accounting language would say that this is a credit transaction. You need to understand the difference between these two transactions. In the earlier transaction, it is mentioned that we have purchased these many fans at 1000 each without mentioning the name of the seller, which means it's a cash transaction. Whereas in the second case, it is mentioned, the name of the seller is mentioned, and there is no mention whether the payment is made right now or not. So we would assume that because in accounting language, when the name is mentioned but there is no mention about cash or bank transaction, we would assume that to be a credit transaction, right? So how do we pass this journal entry for these transactions? Let's have a look at that. The format would be the same. What I need to do is I need to start with the balance which has been carried forward in the last page. It was 20,000. So I would say the balance carried forward from the last page is 20,000. Then I need to enter the transaction for this. Now what are the transaction? I have purchased this. So what are the two accounts which are involved? One would be the purchase account and the other one would be cash account in this case. In the second case, it would be the purchase account and then the creditor, namely Balaji Limited. So how do we pass the journal entry? The first, we would say on 6th of April, I would say purchases account debit to cash. How much is that? 20 fans into 1000 is, this is 20,000 on the debit side, 20,000 on the credit side. I would write the narration here being 20 fans purchased at 1000 each. I would draw a line suggesting that this transaction is closed here, this entry is completed here. Then I would be making the next entry, which is purchase of 50 tube lights from Balaji Limited. Again, my accounts involved here would be purchases and Balaji. As we know that purchases account is debited every time because it's an expense for us, or the other explanation would be goods are coming to us or my assets are increasing, so I am debiting that. And Balaji Limited being a creditor for me, a liability for me. We have seen that whenever the liability increases, that is to be credited. So we are clear that purchase account is to be debited and Balaji Limited's account is to be credited. How do we write this? We would write it like this. I would say purchase account debit to Messrs. Balaji Limited. How much is the amount? 50 tube lights at 100 each. 50 into 100 would be 5,000. I would be recording 5,000 on debit side and 5,000 on the credit side. Then I need to mention the narration. I would say being 50 tube lights purchased from Messrs. Balaji Limited, and I would draw a line stating that this transaction is complete. Now what I am supposed to do is I need to make a total of this. How much is the total for this? This would be 45,000 on the debit side, 45,000 on the credit side. We need to remember that the total of debit would always be equals to the total of credit. If the total is not matching here, which means there is some error in my journalizing the transactions. Clear? So my total for this page would be 45,000, which needs to be carried forward. CF stands for carried forward. BF stands for brought forward. So my total of 45,000 would be taken to the next page. The next transaction is again selling of 10 fans at 1500 each and selling 20 tube lights at 125 each. Again, this would be the format for the journal entry, and I would say 45,000 is the balance carried forward from the last page. Then I need to make the entries for this date, which is 10th of April. I would say 10th April here. On 10th April, sold 10 fans at 1000 each, which means what are the two accounts involved here? One would be the sales account. The other one would be cash account. The same logic would be applicable here. When there is no mention of the name, it would be assumed that this is a cash transaction. So selling 1500 fans selling 10 fans for 1500 each, which means 15,000 would be the amount. Now whenever we sell that, cash comes into the business or my asset goes up. When the asset goes up, what I need to do is asset has a natural balance of debit. Whenever it increases, it has to be debited again. So when cash account is to be debited, sales account would be credited. The other logic would be sales is an income for me, and if you remember, the income has a natural balance of credit. Whenever it increases, it would be credited again. So even if we go by the same that logic, the sales account would be credited and cash account would be debited. So whichever account is to be debited, we need to record that first. So we would say cash account debit to sales account. The amount would be 15,000 on the debit side, 15,000 on the credit side. Narration would be being 10 fans sold at the rate of 1500 each. Transaction is completed here. The next transaction would be selling 20 tube lights to Messrs. Light and Company at 125 each, which means this sale has been made on a credit basis. So this guy would be Light and Company would be a debtor for us. This is an asset for us because we have a right to receive the money from this guy or this organization. So your assets have increased. Whenever the assets are increased, you need to debit that. You have sold goods, your inventory, your stock has gone down, your asset has gone down. So this is to be created in form of the sales account. Sales being an income for you. Again, the same logic which we have seen here. So the entry would be in place of cash, I would say Messrs. Light and Company. Account debit to sales account. How much is that? 125 into 20. How much is that? 250. 2500 on the debit side, 2500 on the credit side. The narration would say being 20 tube lights sold to Messrs. Light and Company at the rate of 125 each. Then what I am supposed to do? I need to make the total here. How much is the total? 45 plus 15, 60,000, 62,500. This is the total for this page, the running total for this page, which would be carried forward to the next page. Clear? Let's look at one more transaction which says on 15th of April paid the shop rent of 10,000, paid the electricity bill of 7,500. So the balance was 62,500, I believe. If it's not 62,500, please check and write that amount here as balance brought forward. Now we need to pass the transaction journal entry for this transaction. It says paid shop rent. What are the accounts involved here? One would be the rent or the shop rent account. The other one would be cash. Also paid the electricity bill of 7,500. One would be electricity expenses account. The other one would be cash account. Which is to be debited? Expenses are to be debited. Cash is an asset. The cash is going down in both the cases. Asset, whenever it reduces, it would be credited. So cash would be credited under both the cases. And the related asset would be debited. Sorry, the related expense would be debited, because debit all the expenses and losses, credit all the gains and profits is the rule for nominal account. So how do we record that? I would write on 15th of April, write the date first. Then this transaction, I would say shop rent account debit to cash. How much is this? 10,000 rupees on the debit column and on the credit column. Narration would be being shop rent paid. Close this. Then we need to pass the entry for electricity bill. I would say electricity expense account debited to cash. How much is this? 7,500 on the debit side and 7,500 on the credit side. This total would be 62,500 plus 10, 72,500 plus 7,500. This would be 80,000. Please check the total if it's correct or not. So what we need to do is, whenever there is a problem of journal entry, we need to identify what are the accounts involved in the transaction, see which account is to be debited, which is to be credited. The debit account is recorded first. It would be starting somewhere from near to this line, and then we have to give some gap before writing the second line, because this stands for the credit entry. The first line is for the debit entry. So this is the way how we need to record the journal entries, right? So the entries which we have seen were the entries wherein you have only two accounts. So these type of entries are called as simple journal entries. Simple journal entries are those entries wherein you have only two accounts which are involved. One account would be going on the debit side, the other one would be going on the credit side. This is called as the simple journal entry. The other type of entry would be compound journal entries, wherein you have more than two accounts. More than two accounts. And this can be a combination. This can be 3, 4, 5, 6 entries anyway. There would be more than one debit account or more than one credit account. There would be one debit and three credits, or three debits and one credit. But you need to understand that in all the cases, the total of debit would always be equals to the total of credit. So in this video, we have talked about the simple journal entries. In the next video, we will see what are the compound journal entries. We will also see how these entries are to be passed by taking few transactions of any business, right? So hope the journalizing of transactions are a bit clear to you. The more you practice, the more easier it becomes, right? Thank you so much and bye.